We're going to discuss the format of the research reports today. So talk about the introduction, the method, results, and discussion, and generally allow for preparation for your individual project. Writing the introduction, you want to make this relevant to people. So talk about the significance of the research, tie it to some current events. Like you can make it about coronavirus. That would be a very topical thing to talk about, or particularly things, say, business responses to it, academic responses, things like that. You can use interesting statistics. You can use hypothetical examples. So set up a thought experiment. Your literature review will then take it from that very general idea down to the specific hypotheses for this study, which will inform the methods and the analysis section. Your 1 or 2 sentences about the sample, research design, and major relevant conclusions for each of your peer-reviewed resources. So, for instance, we talk about the sample. You want to say things like, is there anything interesting about it? Was it particularly large, particularly small? Did it have an unusual number of men or women in it? Was it students versus working people, retirees, anything along those lines? Talk about the research design. Was it a survey, an experiment, a longitudinal study? And major relevant conclusions. And that's the important point. Many studies are going to have multiple conclusions, not all of which are relevant. So remember, when you're writing up your summary of these things, what you're trying to do is you're using your sources to build your hypotheses. You're not writing a book report, so you're not telling me everything about the study. You're telling me the things that are important so that I can understand it. So talking about the sample and its research design allows me to draw conclusions about external versus and internal validity. Talking about the relevant conclusions is what is the ideas and the evidence that are in these sources that help you build your hypotheses. It has absolutely nothing to do with, you're not just summarizing this, you're summarizing this to a purpose. There is a point to it. When you are doing these summaries, avoid plagiarism. So generally you're going to use minimal quotes. As I said, a few weeks ago, sometimes somebody that you're reading has said something in absolutely the best way that you can imagine. You can't think of any better way of saying it. So go ahead and provide a direct quotation. If you do provide a direct quotation, don't just cite your source, i.e. author, date. What you want to also do is provide the page number. That's with a direct quotation. In general, though, you want to paraphrase things. But even when you're paraphrasing a statement from a source, you are going to cite that source, because again, the citations are not about quotations. They're about ideas and information. So wherever you got that idea or the information, you cite there. Citation style, we want in-text citations that are in author's last names and date format of the reference that you are citing there. Once you get to your reference list, I don't particularly care. As I said a few weeks ago, I prefer APA, but as long as you consistently use a style, go ahead and use it for your reference list. But in-text citations, I want last name and date so that I can easily look them up in the reference list if I need to. Your citation or your introduction literature review will generally end with your hypotheses. Like you can clump them all together, or you can build like your logical case for each one individually. But you're going to end with clearly stated hypotheses. And remember, you need 3 hypotheses. So hypothesis 1, hypothesis 2, hypothesis 3, usually H1 dot statement of the hypothesis, H2 dot statement of the hypothesis, and so on. Now, these will typically be directional. For instance, you might say something, if you're using survey A, you might have, in survey X, we might say that fear of failure is positively related to GPA. Or, if you think that it's going to primarily interfere with performance, you might say fear of failure is negatively related to GPA. Now, the important thing there is, if you don't know, if you think both of those are equally plausible, or you just, based on your literature review, it's unclear, like maybe sometimes things are positively related, sometimes they're negatively related, it's okay to make a non-directional hypothesis. You can say fear of failure will be related to GPA, but it's unclear if it will be positively or negatively related. Same sort of thing as like we saw when we looked at the t-test on gender and GPA. We could hypothesize that women would be higher than men because typically women are higher than men on GPA in a lot of settings. But if it's not clear that that would always be the case. So we might simply say that there will be a difference between men and women. As I remind you, there wasn't in our sample, and that's perfectly fine. Just these are typically directional, but they do not have to be. If you don't have enough evidence to make a directional hypothesis, go ahead and make a non-directional hypothesis. And generally write clearly without jargon. In general, what that means is, try to avoid overly technical terms, avoid acronyms. If you must use a technical term or an acronym, you want to make sure that it is clearly defined the first time you use it. So for instance, as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, there's a major measure in organizational behavior called perceived organizational support, which is often referred to as POS. So if I was talking about perceived organizational support, I would write it out the first time I use it, and then in parentheses, I would say POS, and then cite the source for that measure, also in the same parenthesis, generally speaking. Also remember, the first sentences are important. So first sentence is not only of, say, your introduction, which is where you're trying to, if that's your hook, that's where you're trying to capture people's attention, make them care, show them that there's some reason they should pay attention to the research that you are reporting. But also first sentences of each paragraph in each section are particularly important. When it comes to reporting the method, first thing is we're reporting participants. So you're going to talk about the demographics. So how, the percentage of men or women, choose one or the other, that are in there. Any frequency of non-reporting on that. Any other relevant information like average age, if you're using survey A, frequencies of different majors, things like that, so that people reading this can judge the external validity of this, like what other populations might we expect this sample to generalize to, and then describe the data collection or the sampling procedure to allow the reader to judge ethics. So how were people approached, what procedures were used, and also report the response rate. Which was decent for both of our studies, or both of our surveys, I should say. And then you'll report the measures. These are two separate sections, participants and measures. So you'll describe the measures. And by measures, I mean like on Survey X, fear of failure or implicit motivation. You'll state the number of survey items, the response scale. So for instance, you'll say, agree 1, disagree, or strongly agree 1, strongly disagree 7, or whatever way it goes, so that people know what orientation this is. So if it says, if I know that 1 is strongly disagree and 7 is strongly agree, if someone scores a 5 on a fear of failure, I understand that means that they are relatively high in fear of failure. Also, it's usually a good idea to provide at least one sample item, so you don't have to provide the entire scale or the entire measure to people, but a sample item from it so that people can see how it's written if they're unfamiliar with the measure, and then report the reliability in terms of Chromebox Alpha of multi-item measures. And what to do if reliability is low? Well, it's a bit of a judgment call. If it's a bit low, like maybe in the upper 60s, I'd say go ahead and use the measure, but talk about how it should probably be interpreted with a grain of salt. Whereas if it's substantially low, if it's under 0.6 for sure, then you might want to consider not using that measure, or certainly not using it as the focus of a hypothesis. It's also, if it's extremely low, make sure to check those item statistics to make sure that you've correctly reverse scaled items, because if you haven't, that will generally make your alpha much lower. So always make sure you've checked that. We want to report them in terms of reporting the method. We also give descriptive statistics that gives people a feel for the group. So that's for the sample. So provide, if you're going to be testing hypotheses about men versus women or different majors, you want to provide group means and sample sizes. If you're going to be testing only correlational hypotheses, say with correlation coefficients or multiple regression, the mean for the variable is all you need. And try to present your results in user-friendly prose. This goes back to what I was talking about when we went over the results of assignment 3. You don't want to be giving a stats lesson here. You want to make sure you want to talk about it in plain English and then provide your statistical support. So report the value of your test statistic, whatever that is. So whether it's a t, an f, an r, chi-squared, report your exact p-value to 2 to 3 decimal places, with the only exception being if you get something that rounds to 0.00, report p less than 0.001. Cannot emphasize this enough. Don't provide statistics lessons. Don't talk about, say, how you have a nominal variable and an interval variable. Just report the hypothesis test correctly. And again, remember, this is pretty easy in most places, but there are quite a few values to report if you're doing a multiple regression. You need to report the r squared, you need to report the f and its p-value, and the regression code, the standardized regression coefficients and their p-values. Writing the discussion. Inferences are drawn from each result. You want to talk about both supported and non-supported hypotheses. So if your hypothesis was supported, you are going to be you can discuss any implications of that, what it means, and if they're not supported, you can talk about why that might be, why the effects are small, or why you are unable to detect them in the sample. You want to talk about practical implications and recommendations. So again, if you're dealing with survey A, the sample is students, so you might talk about the implications for students, for professors, for university administrators. If you're working with survey B, which is employees, you might want to talk about the implications for employees, for their managers, for higher level leaders in organizations, those sorts of things. You also want to discuss the limitations of the research. That can be in terms of internal and external validity. So these are survey measures, so you can always talk about the threats to internal validity that occur with survey measures, especially since this is not a longitudinal study. You want to discuss anything about this. So again, if you're working with say survey A, you might want to focus on how you can talk about how these are students from one college within one university, one school within one university, that in one province in one country, and so it's unclear how well that would generalize to other settings. You might want to talk about, focus on anything that's unique or special about the sample because that might limit its generalizability. And also you can discuss the reliability of the measures if that was problematic, if it's somewhat low. And try to, when you're writing your discussion, you want to end on a positive note. You want to, your conclusion, sort of like your last paragraph of the discussion, that's what you want to loop back to the significance of the research. You want to connect up the specific research that you have done here with the broader literature or the contemporary concern that you used to introduce this. You want to remind people why this is significant, why it's important. And note that your last sentence is important. They're hard to write well, but you want to try to give a sense of what could be, what's important. You want to kind of like in a single sentence boil down what is the upshot of this research. Other parts of the report, references, you want to give the full citation for all articles mentioned. So again, give that in whatever format it is. Do not just provide library links to it. You want to give, so if you're using APA style, you're going to have all authors' last name and initials, the year that it was published, the title, the journal, and volume number, or pages. Like that's what you're going to have. You can provide the DOI and a URL if you want to. It's usually a good idea to write your title and abstract last. You want to make sure your title is not too long. Typically, you want to keep these around 10 words or less. They can be longer. You generally make it catchy but informative. It's perfectly fine to have just a, correlation between fear of failure and GPA or something along those lines, like just very, very, very descriptive. Sometimes these can be too cute. I think I mentioned that I once did a piece of research just because we wanted to title our presentation "You Underestimate the Power of the Dark Side." That's probably too cute, but there you go. Your abstract again you should write it last. And one model for this is to sort of take the first sentence from each section. So the first sentence from your introduction, the first sentence from your method, the first sentence from your results, the first sentence from your conclude or your discussion. That's not really the way to do it, but the basic idea is you want to do something about setting up why is this research important? What did you do with it? What are the major results or conclusions that come from this? Put that all together because again, you can think about it. The abstract for a research report is basically the same thing as the executive summary for a technical report or a white paper that you would produce for a business organization. So it should be telling, like, it might be the only thing that a lot of people read. So you want to give the upshot. Like, why is this important? What did you do? What did you find? Those are the major things that you're trying to communicate in your abstract. Typically that's going to be 50 to 100 words, definitely no more than 150. And just to note, the length of your paper will depend on the complexity of your hypotheses and your results. So again, we're trying to keep this. We've given you a pretty strict word count of 1,200. And again, remember that does not include your title page, any table, any figures, or your appendix or your references. That's just the written component between your opening sentence and your closing sentence. Um, Refer to the empirical readings as models. You can look at Refreshing Work, the diversity papers, Baking Fever, the auditors. Those are all pretty good resources here. So those are the main things to know about the structure of the report. Again, I'm going to recommend that people not try to sound too smart here. You don't want to, generally you don't want to start this off like from the dawn of time, humans have wondered about whatever. You want to make this concrete. Don't make this abstract. You don't want to generally like bury this in the like philosophical jargon or something along those lines. A good way of making it significant to your readers is to focus on a contemporary problem, like what is an issue the businesses are facing. So, for instance, I collaborate with people working in the realm of human capital, and so a lot of times this is discussing how there's a war for the best talent is a way that people frame that particular business problem frequently. So those are things to keep in mind. It's just the main thing to focus on is trying to be clear. So again, you are being pedagogical. You have to assume that your reader knows less about your specific topic than you do because you've done the library research on it, you've done the statistical analyses, you know more about your paper than anyone else does. So you are teaching whoever is reading this something, but you can't assume that they're completely naive, particularly about the things that are common to research in general. That's part of why we don't give statistics lessons when we're writing up our results. People know the situation. I mean, researchers know the situations that you would use a t-test. They know the situations where you would use a multiple regression. So you don't generally provide a stats lesson. Again, like I said, the only exception is if you are doing something particularly unusual. So for instance, if you were using I don't know, dynamic factor analysis, which most people are unfamiliar with. You'd probably need to describe that in some detail before using it. If you were using, I read a paper once that used genetic algorithms to simplify the data structure. That was unusual. so required considerable explanation. But again, if you're doing that, that will almost always fit into your introduction rather than your results. Your results are always going to focus on the results, with possibly more exposition for unusual results than might otherwise be there. So again, here we're going to focus on reporting those key elements, the descriptive statistics, this test statistic, and its p-value, and whether or not that supports your hypothesis or not. Those are the things to focus on in the results, because you're probably going to be using something pretty big, pretty typical, right? T-test, ANOVA, regression, correlations. All right. Thank you. All right. Have a have a good day. I hope everyone's keeping well. And I apologize if the audio quality is poor. I don't have a better microphone than this. All right. Thanks. Bye.